serious reductions in government expenditures being slated by this new board snip.
And that will presumably lead to more street protests. I mean, we've already seen what happened in the post-budget scenario after the debacle, basically, over the medical card for over 70s. So we are going to get. There's going to be a lot of action around Dáil Éireann in the next year.
The thing is, what's going to happen? It's going to be a bit like. Do you ever watch X Factor?
Yeah.
Okay, now just imagine the judges in X Factor, because what's going to happen is the board snip, there's three of them, led by Colin McCarthy, who was around the last time. And he's going to be like the Simon Cowell. And each of the departments are going to go in and sing for their supper and say why they need to spend money and why they can't cut. And then Cowell, i.e. McCarthy, will put a big X red line through them. And then this will go out to the Cabinet. And what you're going to see is a sort of a judging panel of all what the Department of Finance calls spending departments. This will happen in the next couple of weeks. This is my understanding. Now, I'm not on the inside, but this is what happened last time, so I'm sure this is what's going to happen again. And every single spending department will be vetoed by the board snip, because if we've got to save $5 billion, you've got to start this today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not the week after. You've got to start it today. And if you listen between the lines of what Brian Lenihan was saying this morning, clearly that process has already started.
Okay, let's just talk about the borrowing, because we're talking here as if we're going to actually be able to raise this 16 billion with no great degree of difficulty. That's not necessarily the case. We can't just go to a bank. I mean, you can't go to the European Central Bank and say, listen, lads, can you lend us 16 billion at current ECB rate?
Fair point, Myles. But I think there's a lot of hysteria. I mean, again, I come back to the original point at the top of the programme. A lot of the hysterical comment is now being led by people who this time last year told you that we were having an unprecedented economic boom which would last for another half a decade. Okay? So let's have a pinch of salt about this. There is no risk to the Irish sovereign just yet. Okay? And what I mean by that is that when the NTMA goes out this afternoon or tomorrow to borrow money under the name of the government of the Republic of Ireland,
at rates of 1.5% more than German government bonds, for example.
That's understandable. You know, if you're presiding over delinquency on the basis that we have, clearly the financial markets are saying there is a bigger risk in Ireland. But the point is, this can be financed, and this will be financed in terms of technically the government will go out and the market will lend us money. The issue is, and this comes back to what Mr. Cowan was saying on Sunday, is whether or not the markets would tolerate this year in, year out. You can't go and borrow 5, 6, 7% of GDP over the next 5 years, which is why the adjustment and the action and the really difficult decisions have to come now. You've got to front load everything as quickly as possible. The reason is that in 4 years' time, or 4 months' time, or even 8 months' time, the markets might not necessarily be so tolerant of Ireland. So you've got this kind of ticking clock, like a huge chiming clock inside in Brian Lenihan's head, which we need money, we've got to raise it very quickly. And the second thing is we need to make cuts, and we've got to do those very quickly. So as you said, we are facing into a year of serious political and social upheaval. Number one, in the cosy cartel that is partnership, but number two, as you pointed out, much more probably on the streets.
Okay, in the time we've got left, there's a couple of things I want to raise with you from another one of your, as usual, very interesting columns in the Sunday Business Post last Sunday. I'm going to leave the more complicated one to the end because we may not get time for it and it will take time to go into. But you wrote about deflation. Deflation corrodes an economy. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about inflation, they're thinking in terms of lower prices. They're thinking in terms of a reduction in the consumer price index, and they think, oh, I'll have a bit of that, thank you very, very much indeed, particularly in the context of abandoning wage increases in 2008.
Yeah, well, there's a difference between, and I'm going to be a bit of an economist here, reducing the upward level in price rises, i.e., so price rises aren't at 7% per year, but they're at 1 or 2%, right? That is what most people would think is good and proper. It's a huge difference if prices begin to fall by 10%. Now, you just think about what the real dilemma in Ireland is. It's the ridiculous product of reckless bank lending and absolute lunacy and greed on our part. huge, huge debt overhang, right? So every time you go and you pay your mortgage, let's say your mortgage rate is 5%, that means if your wages aren't rising by 7%, or at least by 5%, every single year your mortgage is really eating into your standard of living.
Because that's how we are able to put up with kind of mortgage, with those sort of mortgages, because they become a diminishing percentage of our income on an annual basis.
Exactly. So basically, say your mortgage is costing you, let's say, €1,000 a year, but your wages are rising by more than €1,000 a year. That's fine. You can deal with it. It's not that it's fine, but you can deal with it. What happens if your wages not only are rising, or not rising, but they're actually falling by 1,000? Therefore, the real cost of your mortgage is 2,000 that you have to find net of your wages. And that's why deflation is a nightmare scenario.
But I suppose part of that deflation is a decrease in mortgage interest rates.
Yeah, but that's not coming because interest rates can only go to zero. Wages can be cut.
Well, they're 2% away from that at the moment.
You see what I mean? Yeah. Interest rates can only go to zero, but real wages can be cut by 10%, as we've seen in many. If you go to many small Irish SMEs, as they're called, small firms, it's not a case of us and them. Everybody is working together, and many, many small firms have already reduced their headcounts. They've actually fired people, they've laid off people, which is very traumatic in a small company because most small companies work together. Many people have also taken 10% wage cuts in the private sector already. And ultimately, that's the type of deflation in an environment that we've built up so much debt over the last 5 or 6 years that can be really traumatic for a country. And that's what I was writing about.
Okay, now the other thing you were writing about was bank lending, and was the fact that banks were lending on the basis of collateral that was unreal. They were lending on the basis of property prices that were absolutely ridiculous and that were, as you say, part of a bubble. But you're also writing about the fact that the opposite is now happening, that banks are not lending on the basis of a decline in property prices and a decline or a potential decline in prices in general. And you're looking for something that you call a moving average.
Yeah, well,
now, in words of one syllable, can you explain that to me?
You've got to come up with solutions now. There's no point people, economists and even opposition politicians, shouting and roaring saying this is awful, right? It is awful, but it's incumbent on those of us who spend our time thinking about these things to come up with certain practical solutions. Now, one of the things that really freaked me out years ago was that banks were misdiagnosing. They were saying that house is worth 1 million, and then it went up to 1.5 million, and they kept using the notional value, okay, the value that everybody talked about as the value of the thing, and now they realise that the house was actually worth 300 grand, and everyone's screwed: the borrower, the banks, the house, etc. Now, what I think we should do in the future is, instead of using today's price, we should use the average price of the last 20 years as the collateral to underpin property prices. So that means you don't have any of these big spikes up and down. You have a smooth average. So ultimately, the price that can be, the amount of money that can be lent against a Dublin house, for example, is not the price today, which is too low, many would say. It's not the price yesterday, which was too high, but it's the average over 20 years.
So
and suddenly,
the value does not equal the price. Is that essentially what you're saying?
The key is
the real value.
The banks have to be told that their balance sheets can play tricks on them, and they're not half as brilliant as they thought they were at the top of the boom. And the way you do this is not by saying such and such is a fantastic banker, okay, and a brilliant, incisive financial mind. What you say is you take away all that, and you say the collateral, i.e. the amount of money the bank can lend against property, has to be not today's price, but the average price over the last 20 years. And suddenly you don't have any ups and downs and booms and busts. And that's where Ireland has to be moving towards, because all this stuff in terms of the government deficit, which we've spoken about, that needs to be done for the sake of the integrity of the state now. That's the first, that's the action. But the next action has to be, how do we promise ourselves that we will never, ever get into this situation again, and we will never endanger the welfare of our children in a stupid property boom that was clearly going to go bust, but nobody at the time had the balls to say it.
David, thank you very much indeed for that. I think I'm going to find it very difficult to get the image of Colm McCarthy as Simon Cowell out of my head. But it's an interesting analogy. Thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.
David, thanks very much. David McWilliams there on the line.